There's only a couple of things that I add, and you can't prove any of this. This is some of the things where you just hope to learn more every time you hear about it. For reason or reasons unknown, the battle down here of Buffalo Wallow starts sunup on the 13th. And apparently it was a group of Kiowas from here leaving. That, at any rate, is the assertion that most of them have. When they started bringing the New Mexico group up, they also were attacked on the same day. And there is a battle that you can see from Mobeetie that we have just found, and I mean just. What had happened was there was a clear description in the All Army manuals about it, how they crossed the Sweetwater and how they got on the ridges, and how on the first ridge a Comanche came down, but they were basically Kiowas, and how that battle started and where their artillery was. And it goes for 6 ridges. And we'd always made the assumption that the crossing was the one that we used. Forget it. Finally, the same guy who did the excavation up here came down. He's looking over maps and he said, well, if it isn't there, let's go on this side. And he goes down to the 6th ridge and makes a crossing. And we have all been looking on this side of all these ridges, and he starts looking on this side of all these ridges, and guess what? He found it. It started at the 6th ridge instead of the 1st ridge. But the battle is identical, and a lot of these are told within your Army histories. And there was another group that apparently had left here. Now, to add a third dimension to it, according to a story that was done in a daily Oklahoma newspaper many years ago in the 20s, there was a third column that had left from here, and all of this is before the Army crosses over and rescues. In other words, there are still people fighting this battle. And there was a third column that all had their supplies in it. And the women and the children took care of the supplies, obviously, and they shielded that battle, shielded that third column with this one that fought up and down the ridges. So that we know that there were 3 columns apparently that had left from here, almost all of them Kiowa on that day, and that 2 of them involved in battles, now both of them famous, although one of them wasn't for a long time. And then the following morning is when the New Mexico group gets up into here. And that's when they can see from their ridges that there's another Army column. And that apparently is when they start withdrawing. Now, when they met the Buffalo Wallow bunch, everybody in Buffalo Wallow was in sad shape. Most of them were critically ill. If they were today, it would have been critical. They wanted to send for help, and they sent one company back to see Miles down in the Paladura. That's just the other side of Claude, down on the JA. And as they started, this company starts back that way, they run into him. He's coming this way. Now stop and think. He sent his wagons back, and he hadn't heard anything. He sent 4 scouts back, and he hadn't heard anything. He sends 6 more after him, and he hadn't heard anything. His assumption is that all of those people have been killed, that the wagons have been captured, that they've been burned, and that he's alone out here, and he's headed back for Camp Supply to get some reinforcements. As he comes up, he's traveling fairly fast. At midnight, again on the 13th, is when they find the Buffalo Wallow bunch. The following morning, they come up to here.
Now that was the second time they'd found the Buffalo Wallow bunch.
Yeah, well, the Buffalo Wallow bunch found them. Right. Dixon found them the first time. The rescue was midnight. Then they come on up the following day, which is the 14th, to the river, to the Washita. And it's been raining. So the Washita is flooded, and they can't cross here. And they take the wagons. The Indians have now departed. The Kiowas have now left. And they start going parallel down the Washita until they find them a place, and it's marked over there. If you go down to where you turn into the Washita, about 2.5, 3 miles in is a nice little slab out there that says this was the headquarters for Nelson Miles and his group, and it's put up by the bunch from Canadian. And that's where the wagon train battle ends, is right down there. They cross, they meet each other, and they stay on this side of the Washita. Excuse me. Just quickly, there were 5 columns of Army. Union, Dodge, Sill, I forget, the 10th came out of one down by Fort Worth, and then Mackenzie.
Griffin and Concho.
Concho, that's it. And then, well, Concho is where Mackenzie comes from. This is another one. It's where the 10th was. But the 5 of them were all meeting in here. And the Paladura was the basis of the whole thing. But this was the longest battle of the bunch, and it is true. In all those fightings, because of the rifle pits, good Lord, I thought I was going to say foxhole there for a minute. They called them rifle pits back in those days. They were dug in, the infantry was dug in, the cavalry made only a handful of charges, there weren't many of them. The Indians' attack was as he explained it. Basically, to, I assume, count coup or whatever one does when one rides between them. And that guy actually rode between the rifle pits and the wagons on one of those runs. And there were very few casualties on either side. On the other hand, at Buffalo Wallow down here, we got one guy killed, 5 of them wounded, 1 of them lost a leg, 3 of them spent long times in a hospital. Nobody knows how many Indians were killed in that fight. In the other fight that took place on the ridges, the Army, I think, lost 3, and the Indians lost several, and no one knows how many. Several casualties. And of course, we don't know where the Indians are buried. We know that almost all of them that were killed during that war were eventually buried at Fort Elliott, and eventually were dug up and taken to Kansas and buried up there, except for 1. And supposedly he's still with us. That's Private Smith, who was killed at Buffalo Wallow and was buried in the Wallow. And the same guy that made the archaeological dig here went down to Buffalo Wallow, and it's of course throughout the years it's been plowed and everything else. He couldn't make a dig down there, he couldn't find anything, but his assumption was that all of you people who put that marker there were right. And that's where Buffalo Wallow was, and Smith is somewhere under that marker. It's enough. I've ruined your afternoon. Thank you.